So this is a discussion of Chapter 3 of Theory and Practice by Jurgen Habermas. And this chapter deals mostly with Hegel in relationship to the topic of revolution and how theory and practice coincide with the idea of revolution. So Habermas leads off the chapter by saying that he believes that Konstantin Ritter is correct in saying that Hegel's philosophy is basically a philosophy of revolution. And Habermas wants to take this a step further and say that revolution is really the first principle of Hegel's philosophy. And Habermas is mostly going to be commenting on Hegel's reason and history and his works on philosophy of right and on the law. So, to just give kind of a brief overview of the way that Hegel thinks about the structure of revolution and how revolutions come to be and the kind of periods that lead up to the culmination of another revolution, I thought that a very good parallel would be Thomas Kuhn's discussion of the development of revolutionary periods in science followed by periods of normal science. So, to give just a very brief sketch and then try to apply it to Hegel's philosophy, for Kuhn, you might have a time period where someone comes along and has a great idea, and in Hegel's terms, you could say that the development of this idea constituted a kind of moment of genius where someone was able to come up with what might count as the next step in the development of our understanding of the world and our understanding of ourselves. And to give an example, you might say that Isaac Newton's development of his theory of gravity constituted this kind of moment of genius, where suddenly the idea that if a projectile, let's say a cannonball, was shot in a vacuum, that the cannonball would continue to move in a straight line if it faced no resistance, as would be the case in outer space if the cannonball were somehow shot from one point, let's say tangent to the circumference of the Earth, that the ball would keep going, but that what explained the ball falling back to the Earth and not going in a straight line was the gravitational pull of the Earth. This could be an example of a revolutionary idea that changed the way people saw themselves eventually and had direct effects on the way that they thought about the world around them. In Kuhn's terms, what followed this moment of genius, this revolutionary moment, is a period of normal science in which, starting from this core idea, a research program developed, and there was an institutionalization of that research program such that individual scientists, groups of scientists, and actual institutions like universities began to develop their time and resources to working out the implications of that theory to finer and finer details. A theory, a paradigm, you could call it, is something that gives scientists an opportunity to test things and see things in a new way so that it allows them to solve problems that they might not otherwise have quite come to grips with in any other way. It justifies their investigation sometimes of minutiae because it enables them to tie their discoveries back to that one central illuminating idea. And then, of course, that period is followed by another period in which a new moment of genius arrives, a new revolutionary moment. And if you lay Hegel's idea of dialectic on top of this moment, of these different moments, you can kind of see how Hegel's idea of history as the ongoing development of reason, worked out through spirit, enacted through works of the spirit, can be understood. So the moment of genius is a moment when spirit actualizes itself in some sort of revolutionary work. That's followed by other works that are part of that normalizing trend, that trend towards institutionalization that resists changes ultimately as part of its founding core mission, because it resists attempts to prove it false. And the dialectical moment that's embedded in that is, for Hegel, that initial moment when the paradigm is established is a moment when people may not quite initially believe that the theory is entirely true, but they eventually come to believe that it is. It eventually comes to have a stronger and stronger pull toward the presupposition that the core of the theory really is true, and it really takes something revolutionary to overthrow it. And what allows for its overthrow is something hidden within the core of the theory, so that when the next revolutionary moment occurs, it occurs as an idea that negates the prior idea. Now, with Hegel's idea about revolutionary moments, we have the unfolding of the spirit, which is enacted through works of the spirit. Those could be the development of scientific theories. It could consist of art, literature, books. Those could be anything that leads to the development of new ideas and self-understanding among the people of a society. And when that development has reached a certain point, a society may be ready for revolutionary change. So the paradigm example of that would be something like the French Revolution. Habermas writes that leading up to the revolution, there were centuries of development toward a bourgeois society that made the ideals of the French Revolution more or less something that could be latched onto, or that seemed evident to the people who were pushing the revolution forward. So things like the right to self-assertion, and just the ordinary way of life of a middle-class person as it developed from the end of the Renaissance up to the 18th century, the end of the 18th century when the French Revolution took place. So from that point, we can jump into what Habermas has to say about Hobbes. And Hobbes, for Habermas, represents someone who did not quite understand that the revolutionary moments in history really require not just a theoretical soundness or a theoretical truth, but actually some sort of real ability to become actualized and realized in positive ways that reflect the ideals of the revolution. So with Hobbes, the problem was that at least for Habermas in his reading of Hobbes. Hobbes tries to set up society in a way that an engineer might construct a society, so that everything is very well regulated. You could kind of think of the analogy of a clock. If only we could set up everything in a clock so that it was running efficiently and smoothly, we would have a very well-ordered, well-run society. For Hobbes, having the right sort of laws, having the right sort of institutions, having the right sorts of relationships in place enables a smoothly functioning society. But what Hobbes leaves out of the picture is whether this sort of society actually conduces to people having a good way of life underneath it. And personally, my thought immediately goes to the experience of what it is like to work in a factory. So here you have a very well-run, very well-regulated picture of the way things should be. There are very strict rules for the sorts of behaviors that people should have and the sorts of things that people should do and not do. But the overall structure, although it contributes to the efficiency of the outcomes and outputs, is not necessarily one that leads to much happiness or much justice within that society, within that social framework. It's not to say that that couldn't occur within that framework, but there's nothing that Hobbes does that really gets at what makes people happy, what serves people's interests in a practical sense, as apart from a mere theoretical arranging of the parts of society in the proper order. This is a point that Habermas doesn't directly bring up, the aspect of happiness, but when he refers to prudence and makes references to virtue as something that was present in the politics of ancient Greece, the ethics of Aristotle, happiness is the guiding principle for Aristotelian ethics. The whole point of prudence, the whole point of virtuous activity is, in the end, to work toward the good and to realize your potential in such a way that you attain some measure of happiness. So with that fuller picture, with that fuller kind of elaboration of the idea of what a virtue-based theory of ethics actually entails, I feel that it kind of amplifies the point that Habermas is trying to make against Hobbes. And his critique of Hobbes is really something that he extends to the political theories of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. These modern theories of political society are really based upon ideas about how to regulate it. And they're ideas that are really based upon prudence, but only insofar as it applies to the legal tradition. So that leads into a discussion of Edmund Burke. And for some readers, Habermas's discussion of Burke might seem a little bit one-sided, but he basically reduces Burke's whole treatment of the French Revolution to a standpoint that the practical, everyday working out of the implications of the law, how the law is to be applied in certain situations, and how we can fine-tune laws to create a more smoothly running society is basically something that can enable society to function better and do away with the need for a revolution. So if we only had a society that was fine-tuned through its legal mechanisms, we could really overcome the sorts of problems that arise in the day-to-day life of people in society. So you might think of what happened with George Floyd as an example. That could have been a turning point, and for a lot of people it was, and it may turn out to be a turning point, depending upon what happens in the presidential election. But for Burke, if this is a fair treatment of Burke, for Burke, maybe what you could say is we could avoid a revolution by simply fine-tuning our laws so that we can overcome that sort of circumstance, so that basically anyone who engages in a certain sort of behavior knows immediately what the consequences will be, and the legislature can work toward finding ways to make sure that the law is applied fairly and evenly. And by doing those things, the state can work toward being more just, more fair, more transparent, and it turns a social problem into a legal problem. It turns a question about justice and morality and ethics into a technical problem about how to frame laws adequately, how to frame laws in such a way that these social problems never need to arise. And if they do, then there's a very clear, evident, straightforward way that the law says that the problem can be dealt with. And for a lot of people, it would seem that that would serve the ends of justice. But if we return to the initial discussion about these moments of revolution in history, for Hegel, these revolutionary moments are eventually going to arise because of the work that people do in society toward their own self-realization. So the work that they do in writing books, having discussions, producing literature, producing art, in this age of social media would even be something like posting things on Facebook. Insofar as these are all manifestations of the Spirit, and insofar as they count as ways that people are moving toward self-understanding and a fuller understanding of themselves in relation to society and to each other, they lead toward a development, an evolution in their way of thinking. And there may come a point when, if the basic way in which society is ordered, as the example of the French Revolution shows, eventually does not serve the needs of the populace adequately, they're going to be looking for a new type of political order. And in our current political situation, it may look like there's no straightforward necessity for a revolution. But if we can imagine our society drifting off towards something much more straightforwardly oligarchical, and where we have two tiers of society that are diverging radically from one another, and one tier of society feels like they're not being treated fairly, either because of undue political influence by the ruling classes, by the oligarchical classes, the people may rise up as a function of their increased self-understanding, their understanding of where they are in society, and decide to restructure and reorder society. And for Hegel, that's always going to be a function of the activity of spirit. And that development is going to occur through the work that people do. That could be even something less artistic, like creating buildings, creating structures, building all sorts of things that help people grow and manifest who they are. And as society develops as a whole, all those contributions contribute to a people's self-understanding of themselves. So you could say that the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror that followed is a very good example of how an idea that seems good in theory does not always work out in practice. And returning to that point about that point of falsity that seems to be hidden initially, or that seems to be erased in the working out of the original core theory. You could say that with the institution of a new social order, like the institution of society following the French Revolution, it would seem that there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing to be objected to in a purely theoretical sense, that it carries with it a kind of evident truth that this is the way things should be, and it conceals some sort of falsity within it, something that's wrong. And if it didn't, it would represent an end stage in the development of human history. And most of the time, it doesn't seem like it's reasonable to expect that we've entered that stage. So we have a theory, we have an idea for society. It gets actualized by the French Revolution. That's the theory of a liberal political state. And following that, we have the Reign of Terror. So during the Reign of Terror, which was led by Robespierre and the Jacobins, there was instituted a strong authoritarian government that has been labeled a despotic regime, which went to the contradictory position of actually limiting the freedom of the people in whose name the revolution had been enacted. A revolution that was about freedom ended up with a governmental, with the institution of a government that was actually suppressing the freedoms of the people it was governing. So it's a contradictory moment, and it illustrates the idea of theory and practice, where something that might seem like a very good idea in theory, when actually worked out in practice, turns out to have very bad, unforeseen implications. So one other point that Habermas brings up in this chapter is a point about absolutizing theory. And this seems to be symptomatic of what happened during the French Revolution, which was that the theory itself took on a level where it was considered to have some sort of absolute validity outside of all history, that we've arrived at a moment where their conception of natural law was considered to be something absolute and final. But the problem with that Habermas points out is that with the influence of a universal idea like that, the role of the individual can become undermined. There has to be room for the individual within that universality. There has to be room for the individual to grow, express himself, have ideas that may be even counter-revolutionary, that may be even ideas that oppose what's considered to be the basic truths of the revolution, in the interest of the further development of society. So finally, I think we can just wrap this up by saying that if we come back to this basic point about dialectic, that these different moments of revolution are actually brought forward by the evolution of spirit, as far as Hegel is concerned, and that they're worked out in a dialectical manner, where we have first, let's say, idea A, which is later contradicted by another theory that stands to it as its negation, constitutes the development of history. And the ultimate goal of this development for the individual and for society is the full realization of freedom. So perhaps going back to the factory worker analogy, there are levels in which an individual may not be entirely free. So one level might be the economic level, but another level could be a spiritual level or an intellectual level in which the work that they are doing may not be adequately fulfilling for them enough. It may be limiting them to a certain extent where they aren't quite free, given their social, political circumstances, to realize themselves more fully, given the constraints of the type of work that they're doing and the economic constraints that underlie that type of work. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye, and that is chapter 3.